Hey, thanks for joining us. I'm Bill Limmer, one of the pastors here at Victory, and I have along with me today Karen Fischer, who's a licensed professional counselor from Christian Family Solutions. She's graciously giving us her time to let us go a little bit deeper and help out a whole lot more people, so we're glad that you joined us. We're in this series dealing with emotions, and so just trying to work around with our feelings and different things. So Karen, why don't you let us in, what are emotions and why do we have them?
Right. Well, thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate it and hope it's going to be edifying to your members and your community. Emotions are curious things. A lot of the time, people, when they come see me, they'd really like to shut off some of those emotions. And so we're going to talk in depth about each of them. But generally, what are emotions for? They're here to give us information, right? So a lot of the time we have words to express how we feel about things or what's going on. But we also, God also gave us emotions to sort of paint a better picture, fill in the blanks, and to kind of change the order of operations in our brain. Sometimes when we have an emotion, it'll float something to the top, so we have to pay attention to it. Particular ones like anger and fear do that a lot. So emotions give us a lot of information, and they kind of paint a better picture of what's happening so we can do things. Okay. Does that help?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Very good. Okay, so this last weekend, we talked about these guys that are known as the two disciples of Emmaus, and they're walking back home, and they are just filled with grief because all their hopes and dreams are gone. Mm-hmm. What does grief tell us?
Grief. Well, grief we use in that sense, right? They're grieving the loss of Jesus. They are grieving the loss or the death of someone they cared about. And so grief, a lot of times we say, has to do with the death of people we love. That's true. But really, grief is just loss of any kind. You think back through like the pandemic years, maybe we're still there. There were all kinds of losses that happened, right? We had seniors who lost the opportunity to graduate high school like we would typically do, or visiting. I remember not being able to visit my mom on Easter, and what a loss that felt like. So grief really is just loss of any kind. And it pops up and tells us, something valuable is not available to you anymore. And you kind of want to pay attention and see, what does that feel like? How do I get through that, past that, so that I don't sit there with it for an inordinate amount of time.
So what are some of the stages that we can expect to go through if we have grief? And then are those things one after another, or do they get to switch around and move back and forth?
Great question. So a lot of people are familiar with the stages of grief, and depending on how you look at it, there's 5 or 7 stages that people typically go through. And so those are not necessarily on a continuum. We can come in and out of those. So denial, bargaining, anger, wanting to bargain with God or ask for something in return. And then finally, that idea of like acceptance is sort of where we get through the last stage, right? So having stages of grief or different, let's say, moods that you go through in relation to that loss, that's a very common human experience, and we find it in the Bible a lot too. You could probably tell a lot of stories about how grief worked in the Bible, but very common in the human experience to really have those 5 at least things like depression and go along with grief. So Pretty common.
Very good. Is guilt one of those?
It can be. So a lot of times when we talk about even survivor's guilt, that really has to do with loss and grief. It may be a misplaced idea of who's responsible for what, or who makes the rules about loss, right? God makes the rules about loss, but sometimes we feel guilt, and it's probably an inappropriate guilt in that case. We'll talk about guilt, I think, in a couple of weeks here. But yeah, for sure, people feel that this mix of emotions probably with grief.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Are there any tips that you can give us for processing through grief?
Yeah. There's one I like to use a lot called the grief tasks. So it's different than the stages of grief. Stages of grief kind of comes and goes. The grief tasks go right in order. So there's 4 of them, and they have an acronym, which I always love. I love an acronym. So the grief tasks acronym is TEAR, T-E-A-R. So step 1 would be to totally embrace the fact or understand that you are in a grief situation, that you have a loss. So you're going to totally accept that. Sometimes we can tell when people haven't done that, right? They remember someone I met real early on in my career was having trouble totally accepting the loss of her husband, and she would go visit that cemetery every day, right? So it's hard. She's not really accepting it. She sees it, but not totally accepting that it's happened, right? So that was step 1. Step 2 is to really experience the pain of what's going on. So a lot of times we want to avoid pain. So that's what kind of program to do, right? Seems reasonable. But the problem with that, if we avoid pain, then we really can't say we've accepted it, right? We're just sort of brushing it aside. So I know when you do funerals, you know, you see people really experience that grief and that loss. That's okay. We want that. We want to be able to process, make sure we understand it, and experiences help us do that. So that's step 2 of those grief tasks. Step 3 of the grief tasks really would be adjusting. So you're looking at, okay, now I have this loss, this death, whatever it might be. I now need to adjust to that reality. Okay, I don't get to just keep living in the reality I was living in before. Things have to change. Right? So it could be that I no longer have someone to eat dinner with.
Right.
You know, that's a big adjustment. My mom lost my dad a number of years ago, and she says that's still the hardest, you know, to adjust to that loneliness or whatever it is. But that's part of the task that you have to do to get through it. And then the last one, really, where we see people doing well is when they kind of reinvest in the new reality. So not only have they kind of accepted it and adjusted to it, but now they kind of re-up and they're like, oh, there's something good, something here that I wouldn't have had otherwise. So like in the case of my family, it's interesting. I was real close to my dad. And when he passed away, I think the readjustment for me was being able to have a closer relationship with my mom, which I wouldn't have had, right, if he was still here, maybe.
Yeah.
So that reinvestment really says, not only have I understood it, accepted it, and now adjusted, but there's actually more now, right? And that's when we really see people having moved on from their grief.
That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you for
sure.
sharing. So when someone is going through grief, how can we best walk along with them?
Yeah. And, you know, the trick with grief is you look at those stages and you look at the tasks. There's a lot going on. So to me, it's always listening. You have an opportunity to really support people by listening. And I know for you, for me, anybody, when people listen to us, right, that's really reaffirming, and it makes us feel a part of the world again. We're not alone with our thoughts. So listening is really the biggest, I think, contribution you could make to somebody in grief. And then probably just time. You know, you think about maybe grief that you've gone through or others, how much time you spend with people, especially if, you know, the grief ends up being the loss of someone they love. That's really valuable a lot of the time. So figuring out where can I spend that time, how can I listen, and really it's also ask them. If you're going to spend time with them, how would they like to spend that time? Would they like to go to lunch and not talk about it? You know, what would they like? You know, and how can you be hospitable to that? You know, there's very simple things, but it takes commitment to do them.
Right.
You know, to really love people.
What about lamenting?
Yeah, lamenting is a fascinating idea to me, and it's a very uniquely, I think, Christian idea to look at grief and to say there could be a process, even prescribed in the Bible, that we could follow to get through grief, and lamenting is part of that process. So especially in the Psalms, when I talk about lamenting with people, I often use Psalm 13. And you think through the structure of the Psalm. When we're grieving, a lot of times we're tempted to go inward and to sit with our thoughts and feel bad for ourselves. And we do that grief process and all of those things somewhat alone. But lamenting through Scripture really shows us that it's about a relationship to God, right? So the lamenting process, either from a scriptural standpoint or a secular standpoint, would be really helpful. So there's really only 4 things you need to know about lamenting. Number 1 is you want to address God. You want to go ahead and have a relationship with him and say, this is what's going on. I have a personal relationship with you. What's happening, right? And you can voice your complaint. And you can say, I feel lonely, or I feel lost because of this grief, and express that, and then request what you want. What would I like to see from God in this moment? And then to close that with expressing your trust and confidence in his promises, right? And to sit with that for some period of time psychologically makes sense. We don't do it like we talked about, right? We normally want to avoid pain. And really struggling with it and lamenting over the loss seems like it would be a bad idea. But in this way, it really gives us a connection to God, even if we're on our own. And to move through that together seems to be the freeing principle of lamenting. So even if I'm going to do that on my own, I don't want to go inward. I don't want to curl up in a ball by myself with my grief. I want to connect. And the Psalms give us a way to practice it, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Very cool. Thank you very, very much for sharing
Sure.
these with us. I know it's going to help me, right? Not only as me going through different things, but then to be able to help other people too. So thank you so much for your time today.
My privilege. Thanks for having me.